June 1943. 23-year-old Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson gripped the control stick of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever sent into combat. His squadron, the 56th Fighter Group, had just crossed the Channel, escorting returning bombers from France. Below them, the clouds rolled like a white ocean. Above, silence. Then, from the glare of the sun, death came. 16 Focke-Wulf 190 seconds plunged out of the sky like hawks striking pigeons. Cannon shells ripped into the American formation. In seconds, Johnson's world turned into a storm of fire and metal. Hydraulic fluid burst across his face, burning his eyes. Shrapnel tore into his right leg. The canopy jammed, locking him inside a flying coffin that refused to die. He tried to bail. The canopy opened 6 inches no more. Flames licked along the engine, cowling. He was half blind, choking, certain the end had come. And then, impossibly, the fire went out. The Thunderbolt, bleeding smoke and oil, kept flying. Through the haze of pain, Johnson steadied the control column. Behind him, a lone German fighter, perhaps Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's deadliest, swooped in for the kill. Cannon empty, the German pressed in with machine gun fire, raking the P-47 again and again. Johnson's cockpit shook with impacts. He could barely see, barely breathe. But each time the German fired, the American plane refused to fall. On the third pass, the German stopped. He drew alongside the shredded Thunderbolt, stared at the young American still gripping his controls, and in an extraordinary gesture of respect waggled his wings in salute before turning back toward France. When Johnson finally landed at RAF Manston, ground crews counted over 200 bullet holes, 21 cannon impacts, and hydraulic systems torn apart. They called it a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle. It was engineering. What Robert Johnson and his Thunderbolt proved that day would change the air war over Europe and reveal a secret the Luftwaffe never truly overcame. Because the P-47 was more than a fighter. It was the embodiment of an American idea that in war, survival was victory. It wasn't built for elegance or speed. It was built to bring its pilot home. And from that day on, German pilots began asking the same question after every encounter: why won't it go down? When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first appeared over England in late 1942, even Allied pilots doubted it. It was huge, absurdly huge, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire, with wings thick enough to stand under and landing gear that looked like it belonged on a bomber. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't graceful. And when the British first saw it, they joked that the Americans had built a flying milk jug. The nickname stuck, the Jug. But inside Republic Aviation's hangars at Farmingdale, Long Island, one man knew exactly what he was doing. His name was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled Europe after the First World War. He wasn't trying to build the fastest fighter in the world. He was trying to build the toughest. Kartveli had watched European designers worship at the altar of aerodynamics, cutting every ounce of weight, trimming every inch of structure to gain a few miles per hour. To him, that was a fatal obsession. Because war, he believed, wasn't about perfect geometry. It was about staying alive long enough to learn. So, while others shaved metal, Kartveli added it. He built a frame that could take 12 Gs without bending. He reinforced wings that could keep flying with holes the size of fists. And then he found the heart of his beast, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of delivering 2,000 horsepower. When that engine roared to life, it didn't sound like refinement, it sounded like thunder. The Germans, when they first captured photos of the P-47, dismissed it as nonsense. Their intelligence reports called it inefficient and clumsy. One Luftwaffe analyst even wrote, "It will never be competitive. They've built a bomber pretending to be a fighter. They were half right. It was a bomber's soul in a fighter's body, with 8 50 caliber machine guns, self-sealing tanks, and armor wrapped around the pilot like a medieval knight's plate. Where a German 190 sacrificed everything for agility, the American Thunderbolt sacrificed nothing for survival. To American engineers, that wasn't waste. It was insurance. They knew that a war of attrition was coming, not a tournament of elegance. And when thousands of 20mm shells filled the skies of Europe, they wanted a machine that could fly home with half its engine missing and a pilot still breathing. Even the test pilots who first flew it understood the contradiction. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't light. But when they pulled back on the throttle and felt that enormous propeller bite the air, they realized something strange. The heaviness wasn't a weakness. It was a promise. A promise that when you were 6 miles up, outnumbered, and on fire, this thing might just get you home. That philosophy, strength before speed, survival before style, was about to be tested over the fields of France, and when it was, it would humiliate the most elite fighter unit in Germany. June 26, 1943. The English Channel glistened below like a sheet of broken glass. At 28,000 feet, 48 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group thundered eastward, their propellers shimmering in the thin air. Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson flew tail-end Charlie, the loneliest spot in the sky. Behind him, nothing but blue emptiness and the promise of enemy eyes. Johnson was only 23. The son of a poor mechanic from Oklahoma, he'd worked odd jobs through the Depression to pay for flying lessons. He'd earned his pilot's license the day before his 16th birthday. Now, 7 years later, he sat behind 2,000 horses of American fury, leading him toward German territory and his date with immortality. They had just crossed the coast of France when it happened. Out of the high sun 16 Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader 26, Germany's most elite fighter wing, dove from 32,000 feet. A textbook ambush. The first pass shredded the formation. Tracer rounds and cannon shells lit the sky like a fireworks display gone mad. Johnson's Thunderbolt took the brunt. A shell burst against the fuselage. The canopy exploded inward, glass slicing his cheek. Hydraulic lines ruptured, spraying hot fluid across his face and into his eyes, blinding him. A 20mm cannon round smashed into the tail. Another tore through the wing root. He was hit, bleeding, half blind, his aircraft aflame. "Bail out!" someone shouted over the radio. He tried. He pulled the canopy lever. Nothing. It had jammed. He kicked at it, slammed it with his fist. It opened 6 inches, 6 inches between life and death. He couldn't squeeze through with his parachute. The fire roared closer, and then it went out. Starved of fuel by the ruptured lines, the flames choked themselves out. In the eerie quiet, Johnson realized he was still alive, trapped, but alive. He grabbed the stick, forcing the crippled Thunderbolt level. Blood and hydraulic oil dripped from his chin. His oxygen mask was gone. His right leg throbbed with pain. He couldn't see properly, couldn't feel half his hand. But he was flying. He turned northwest, limping toward the channel, praying the engine would hold. And that's when the lone Focke-Wulf 190 appeared behind him. The German pilot, believed to be Lieutenant Egon Meyer, an ace with over 100 kills, swooped in for the finish. But Meyer had a problem. He'd already expended his cannon shells, destroying B 17 seconds earlier that day. All he had left were rifle-caliber machine guns. Meyer made his first pass. Bullets smashed into the P-47's wings, peppering the fuselage. Johnson's cockpit filled with smoke and glass. The Thunderbolt didn't fall. Meyer turned again. A second pass. More impacts. More sparks. The American plane kept flying, limping through the sky like a wounded animal that refused to die. On the third pass, Mayer emptied his last rounds, and still the jug stayed airborne. Then something unexpected happened. He pulled alongside the shattered fighter, close enough for Johnson to see his face through the canopy. The German ace looked over, studying the wreck that refused to drop. And then, with a small, almost admiring motion, he waggled his wings in salute and turned for home. Robert Johnson barely made it back across the channel. He could see only a blur through his swollen eyes. Yet somehow, miraculously, the landing gear deployed. He touched down at Rafmanston, skidding to a stop as ground crews rushed forward. When they saw the aircraft, they fell silent. 21 cannon hits, over 200 machine gun strikes, the canopy shredded, the control cables severed, and the engine somehow still turning. They called it luck. But in truth, it was proof that Kartveli's flying tank worked. That day, the Luftwaffe learned something they'd never wanted to believe. You could kill the pilot, but you couldn't kill the plane. The wreckage of Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt should have been a death certificate. Instead, it became a revelation. When ground crews at RAF Manston inspected the mangled aircraft, they found a miracle of American over-engineering. Control cables were severed, yet the backups had taken over. Fuel lines were punctured, but the self-sealing tanks had swollen shut, stopping leaks. The engine had lost cylinders, yet the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 still turned with relentless rhythm. In any other fighter, those hits would have shredded the wings, ignited the tanks, and killed the pilot instantly. But the P-47 kept flying because it had been built to do exactly that. To understand how it survived, you had to look at the machine itself. Beneath its rugged skin was a network of redundant systems, thicker gauge metal, and protection in every direction. The pilot sat inside what ground crews called the armored bathtub, though that phrase hardly did it justice. 2-inch steel plates lined the seat and cockpit walls. The headrest was a slab of hardened armor. Even beneath the pilot's feet, another plate shielded against ground fire during strafing runs. The windscreen, thick, bulletproof glass, could stop a 30mm cannon shell. And then there were the self-sealing fuel tanks, perhaps the greatest unsung hero of the war. Each tank was layered with treated rubber that swelled when soaked in gasoline. When a bullet tore through, the rubber expanded, closing the hole in seconds. German pilots, used to watching their targets erupt in flames, suddenly faced opponents that smoked, bled fuel, and kept coming. But toughness alone wasn't what made the Thunderbolt terrifying. It was the psychological effect that toughness created. German aces like Heinz Bär, who would go on to score 220 victories, recalled the frustration of facing the P-47. We could hit them repeatedly with cannon. We could see our shells strike, but the pilot never fell. He waited and then he shot back. The Luftwaffe's finest suddenly found themselves haunted by an opponent that didn't play by the rules of fragility. Where the Bf-109 and Foch-190 danced through the air like rapiers, the Thunderbolt was a warhammer. Slow to lift, slow to turn, but when it hit, it shattered everything in its path. And it didn't need to be beautiful. It only needed to survive long enough to fire back. When Luftwaffe intelligence first captured a downed P-47, they took it to Rechlin, their secret testing facility. German engineers disassembled it piece by piece. Their reports, recovered after the war, read like a mixture of admiration and disbelief. They wrote, "The American fighter uses substantially more material than required. It is redundant, heavy, and inefficient, yet operationally effective. The pilot is exceptionally well protected. The design philosophy differs completely from our own." That single phrase, "differs completely from our own," said it all. The Germans built fighters to win duels. The Americans built fighters to win wars. Every ounce of extra aluminum, every redundant cable, every inch of armor, it all served one purpose: to bring the man home. That philosophy would soon become the most dangerous weapon in the Allied arsenal. Because a pilot who survives learns, and a pilot who learns becomes lethal. As June turned to July, the 56th Fighter Group began rewriting air combat doctrine in real time. They realized that the Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane that could take hits, it was a plane that could change how you fought. And that realization, born in blood, smoke, and steel, was about to turn the air war over Europe upside down. By the summer of 1943, the skies over Europe had become a crucible of fire. The American 8th Air Force was sending waves of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds deep into German territory, and the Luftwaffe was throwing its best at them. Each mission was a coin toss, half the crews never came back. But that was before the Thunderbolt learned how to fight. Major Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, studied the early reports from pilots like Robert Johnson. He realized that the P-47's greatest flaw, its weight, could also be its secret weapon. While Spitfires and Mustangs danced on agility, the Jug could dive like a stone and climb like a rocket. In a dive, gravity was its ally. And in those dives, the Americans discovered something terrifying. The P-47 didn't just fall, it plunged. Its massive frame sliced through the air at nearly 500 miles per hour without shaking apart. No German fighter could follow it that fast without risking structural failure. That became the first new rule of survival. When in trouble, point the nose down. The Jug will outrun anything alive. But Zemke saw beyond escape tactics. He wanted aggression. He rewrote the manual. Pilots were told to press the attack, not break off when hit, not flinch from head-on fights. The Jug could take it. The Jug would get you home. Out of this thinking came a new formation, the Zemke fan. Instead of tight clusters that limited visibility, the P-47 seconds spread wide like the fingers of a hand. Each pilot covered the other, flexible and lethal. When German formations dived in, the Americans didn't scatter, they turned into the attack, meeting cannon fire head-on, trusting their armor and firepower to win the split-second duel. It worked. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe's own reports admitted something unprecedented. Thunderbolts are highly resistant to gunfire. Do not assume visible damage means destruction. German aces were being forced to dump their entire ammunition loads into a single American fighter just to try to bring it down, and most failed. The result was a quiet but devastating change in morale. For the first time, veteran German squadrons were told in official directives, avoid extended combat with Thunderbolts whenever possible. That line, written in the summer of 1943, marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's psychological defeat. Their pilots no longer trusted their weapons, they no longer believed in quick kills, and once belief breaks, so does courage. On the other side of the channel, the 56th was turning that fear into momentum. Major David Schilling, the group's operations officer, noticed something no one had put into words before. The P-47 didn't just survive, hits it allowed you to stay in the fight longer. Pilots could linger behind bomber formations, chase stragglers, dive through flak, and still make it home. Every extra minute in the air meant one more enemy fighter and destroyed. The Thunderbolt was rewriting combat math itself. German pilots, meanwhile, were learning the cost of their elegance. Their Bf 109 seconds and 190 seconds could twist and climb, but their lightweight frames burned fast when hit. They were thoroughbreds. The Jug was a bulldozer, and bulldozers win long wars. By autumn, the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine was in crisis. The once arrogant German fighter command began issuing desperate orders. Achieve victory in the first pass. If the American continues fighting, disengage. That single sentence buried in a captured document revealed everything. The hunters were becoming the hunted. And above the grey fields of France, the thunder of those 18 cylinders became something more than sound. It was a message, a warning. The old rules of the air were gone. The jug had changed them forever. Every war reveals a secret about the people who fight it, and by 1943, the P-47 had revealed America's. Where Germany built fighters to outfly and outturn, the United States built them to outlast. It was a difference born not in the skies, but in the factories. To the Germans, a fighter was a duelist's blade, honed to perfection, balanced to the gram. To the Americans, it was a tool, heavy, reliable, made to work in mud, snow, or hellfire. And in the long war over Europe, it was the American philosophy that proved unstoppable. By late 1943, Luftwaffe command was growing desperate. The Rechlin test reports from captured P-47 seconds had been circulated through headquarters. One engineer summed it up in a single frustrated paragraph. Their design is wasteful. It is redundant in every system, but it keeps flying when ours do not. It wasn't just the machines that differed, it was the men behind them. German pilots were the product of elite, expensive training, carefully chosen and irreplaceable. American pilots were trained en masse, hundreds at a time, in rugged, standardized aircraft that mirrored the toughness of their machines. A German ace like Heinz Bär might have 200 kills, but his replacements had only a few hours of flight time. An American pilot who survived 3 missions became better, faster, deadlier, because his plane kept him alive long enough to learn. Major Hub Zemke understood this perfectly. He told his men, "Gentlemen, you're not flying a sports car, you're flying a tank with wings. Use it." And they did. Thunderbolt pilots began pressing attacks, even when smoke trailed from their wings. They flew head-on through cannon fire, trusting their armor to take the punishment. Their survival rates justified the risk. That shift terrified the Luftwaffe. They were facing opponents who seemed suicidal but weren't. They were rational men flying irrationally tough machines, and that combination broke the Germans' confidence. Even the most celebrated aces felt it. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, second only to Erich Hartmann in kills, later recalled his frustration. "We hit them again and again. In the east, a single burst brought down a Russian fighter. Against the Thunderbolt, we emptied our magazines. It did not fall." Behind that frustration was a truth no one on the German side wanted to say aloud. Their perfectionism had failed them. The Luftwaffe's fighters were surgical instruments, precise, deadly, but fragile. The Thunderbolt was a sledgehammer, and in the Industrial War of 1943, the sledgehammer was winning. By autumn, even Adolf Galland, commander of all German fighter forces, began to see the shift. He ordered his pilots to ignore American fighters and concentrate only on bombers, calling them the real threat. But that order had the opposite effect. Freed from defensive duties, Thunderbolt pilots became hunters, striking at German formations before they could reach the bombers, tearing through squadrons with brutal efficiency. And the more they fought, the better they got. Survival was the greatest teacher of all. A young pilot who lived through 10 missions in a Thunderbolt could master tactics, timing, and instinct that no simulator could teach. By contrast, German replacements were dying before they finished learning to fight. That was the hidden equation of air warfare. One side was losing planes, the other was losing pilots, and in the end, pilots mattered more. Every Thunderbolt that limped home on fire, every wreck that still managed to land, meant another man ready to fly again tomorrow. The Luftwaffe's engineers had created machines that looked unbeatable on paper. The Americans had created machines that refused to die in practice. One design philosophy chased perfection, the other chased survival. And in 1944, Survival was victory. By mid-1944, the P-47 had earned its reputation in the skies, but now it was about to earn a new one on the ground. The Normandy landings had opened a new front, and as Allied troops clawed their way through the hedgerows of France, they needed more than air cover. They needed a hammer. And the Thunderbolt, with its thick armor, heavy guns, and unbreakable frame, became that hammer. Gone were the elegant duels above the clouds. Now the Jug roared low, treetop level over enemy convoys, rail lines, and fortified positions. It carried bombs, rockets, napalm tanks, and the same 8 50-caliber machine guns that could chew through steel. Its pilots flew into curtains of anti-aircraft fire so dense it looked like black rain. But unlike the lighter P-51 seconds or Spitfires, the Thunderbolt could take it hit after hit, shrapnel tearing through its wings, and still bring its pilot home. One of those men was Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon of the 362nd Fighter Group. On July 25th, near Saint-Lô, his Thunderbolt was struck by 3 direct hits from 37mm guns. One round shredded the wingtip. Another smashed through the engine, destroying 2 cylinders. A third tore his elevator cables clean through. Any other plane would have spiraled into the earth. Harmon didn't. He throttled back, shut off the engine to smother the fire, restarted it again, and nursed his crippled Jug all the way back across the channel, flying on 16 of 18 cylinders, using trim tabs instead of elevators to steer. He landed safely, walked away. The plane was written off for parts, but Harmon flew 89 more combat missions before the war ended. Stories like that became routine. Ground crews joked that the Jug only needed 3 things to fly: an engine running on half its cylinders, 1 working aileron, and a pilot with guts. They weren't far wrong. The German soldiers on the ground came to know that sound, the deep, rolling thunder of the R-2800, and they feared it. They called the plane the Jabo, short for Jag Bomber, fighter bomber. But soon the nickname carried a different tone, whispered with dread. To German infantrymen, Jabo meant death from the sky. The Thunderbolt's machine guns could shred an armored truck in seconds. Its rockets, each with the explosive power of an artillery shell, could rip open a Tiger tank's rear armor. And its bombs turned convoys into twisted scrap. By the summer of 1944, Thunderbolt groups were flying thousands of sorties a week, softening resistance ahead of Allied advances. One German POW later recalled, "You did not fear the bombers, you feared the Jabos. The bombers passed once, the Jabos came back again and again." This new role wasn't just strategy, it was psychology. The same unkillable fighter that had once survived the Luftwaffe's guns was now teaching German soldiers on the ground that resistance was futile. They could see it, bullets hitting the Jug, flak bursting all around, and still the beast kept flying, screaming down to unleash its fury. From escort to executioner, the Thunderbolt had evolved into the perfect symbol of Allied dominance, unstoppable, relentless, and merciless when unleashed. Even its sound became legend, the deep radial growl echoing over Normandy villages, followed by the crack of machine guns and the thunderclap of bombs. To Allied troops on the ground, it was the sweetest music in the world. To the enemy, it was the last sound they ever heard. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was in retreat, the German army shredded from above. But the P-47 wasn't finished. It would be there for the last desperate battles, still flying, still killing, still coming home with holes you could stick your arm through. The Jug had begun as a defensive escort. Now it was a weapon of annihilation, proof that in modern war, toughness didn't just save lives, it ended wars. New Year's Day, 1945. The dawn of Germany's last great gamble in the air, Operation Bodenplatte. 850 Luftwaffe fighters roared off icy runways, bound for Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The goal was desperate but simple: destroy Allied air power on the ground in one sudden strike. For a few brief hours, it worked. Explosions thundered across the fields. Hundreds of parked aircraft burned. But by midday, the illusion of victory had evaporated and the Thunderbolts were in the air. P-47 squadrons scrambled into the chaotic sky, engines roaring like avalanches. The Luftwaffe's final offensive quickly became a massacre. German pilots, many barely trained teenagers, dove into combat against veterans who'd survived hundreds of sorties. They came face to face with men flying machines that refused to die. The fight raged for hours across the Low Countries. At one airfield, a German formation swooped low to strafe, only to be met by climbing thunderbolts that erupted from the tree line, cannons blazing. Within minutes, half the attackers were gone, torn apart by 8 synchronized streams of 50 caliber fire. When the smoke cleared, 271 German aircraft were destroyed, along with 143 pilots killed or missing, including senior aces and squadron leaders. The Luftwaffe never recovered. Not one Thunderbolt was lost in air-to-air combat that day. The German reports from Bodenplatte were tragic in their honesty. Pilots fired entire ammunition loads at Thunderbolts and Mustangs, seeing multiple hits, yet they did not fall. Our losses are unsustainable. It was the same nightmare that had haunted them since 1943, an enemy that absorbed punishment and gave none back until it was too late. Among the survivors of that mission was Major Gerhard Barkhorn, second highest scoring ace in history with 301 victories, nearly all on the Eastern Front. He described one encounter that day. I emptied everything I had into a Thunderbolt every round. I saw the hits. It smoked, pieces flying off, but it kept flying. In Russia, with that ammunition, I could have downed 5 fighters. Against the Americans, 1. And it lived. That was the cruel mathematics of the late air war. For every German pilot who died, it took days or weeks to train a replacement, if one existed at all. For every Thunderbolt that limped home, there was another pilot ready to fly again tomorrow. The statistics told the story brutally. By 1945, over 15,600 P-47 seconds had rolled off American assembly lines, more than any other U.S. fighter except the P-51 Mustang. They flew 546,000 combat sorties, destroyed nearly 7,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railcars, and 6,000 armored vehicles. But the most important number wasn't what they destroyed, it was what they didn't lose. The Thunderbolt's loss rate per sortie was 0.7%, the lowest of any U.S. fighter in Europe. For every 1,000 missions, only 7 jugs didn't return. Compare that to the P-38 Lightning's 13 or the P-51's 9. The difference wasn't luck, it was design. Every ounce of armor, every redundant control line, every pound of wasted steel meant one thing: survival. Each pilot who climbed out of a battle-scarred jug represented one more man alive, one more veteran ready for tomorrow's war. The Luftwaffe couldn't match that. They ran out of men long before they ran out of courage. By the spring of 1945, the German Air Force was a ghost. Aces like Galland and Steinhoff were grounded or imprisoned. Their factories were rubble. Their skies belonged to the jug. The final blow wasn't delivered by speed or elegance or technology. It was delivered by endurance, the relentless, grinding resilience of a machine built not for beauty, but for war. As the smoke of Bodenplatte faded, even the surviving German commanders began to understand. Performance wins battles. Survivability wins wars. And the Thunderbolt had just survived its way to victory. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The airfields that once roared with the thunder of radial engines were suddenly quiet. And for the men who had flown the P-47, silence felt stranger than danger. Across England, France and Germany, the great jugs stood lined in rows, scarred, patched, pitted with bullet holes, but still intact. The same aircraft that had taken unimaginable punishment now waited in peace, their mission complete. They had done what they were built to do. They brought their pilots home. Over 2,000 Thunderbolt pilots gathered for reunions in the years after the war. At one such gathering, in 1961, Colonel Hub Zemke, leader of the famed 56th Fighter Group, stood before a sea of graying veterans and said, "We didn't fly the fastest fighter. We didn't fly the most maneuverable fighter. We flew the fighter that brought us home. And that's the only kind that matters." The room erupted in applause, not for glory, but for gratitude. They knew what he meant. Every extra inch of aluminum, every redundant wire, every ounce of armor was more than engineering. It was compassion, forged in steel. Designers like Alexander Kartveli and his team at Republic Aviation hadn't just built machines, they had built lifelines. Post-war analyses confirmed what those men already knew in their bones. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined thousands of combat reports and found that the P-47 required more hits to destroy than any other Allied fighter, sometimes 3 times as many. German pilots had to empty their entire magazines, often firing hundreds of rounds, just to cripple one jug, and even then, half of them still made it home. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top fighter commander, admitted in post-war interviews, the P-51 was more elegant, the Spitfire was more beautiful, but the P-47 was nearly unkillable. You could hit it, and it would keep coming. That was psychological defeat. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, another legendary German ace, went further. It was the physical embodiment of American industry, excessive, overbuilt, and relentless. We flew fine instruments, they flew fortresses, and in the end, the fortresses won. He was right, because wars are not won by duels. They're won by survivors. The Thunderbolt's legacy didn't end with the peace of 1945. Its philosophy, protection first, survival, always became the blueprint for future generations of fighters. The F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, even the A-10 Thunderbolt II, all carried the same bloodline. That last one, the A-10, even bore its ancestor's name. Its pilots sit inside a titanium bathtub, its engines are shielded, its frame can fly with half its structure missing. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same design philosophy that Alexander Kartveli wrote into the DNA of the first jug. Even today, when surviving P-47 seconds fly at air shows, old veterans, men now in their 90s, still reach out to touch the cold metal. Their hands tremble, tracing the rivets, feeling the ghosts beneath their fingertips. Sometimes, German veterans stand beside them, men who once tried to shoot those machines down. And in that quiet, decades later, the Grood. War seems very far away. They don't talk about victory or defeat. They talk about survival, about men who came home because of this improbable, indestructible machine. They talk about thunder, because the P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was a promise to every pilot who climbed into it that someone, somewhere, had built a machine that cared whether he lived or died, that he mattered, and that promise, made of aluminum and courage, decided the air war over Europe. The Germans hit it again and again. They watched it smoke, flame, and falter, but it refused to fall. And in that refusal lay the truth of the war itself. The Thunderbolt didn't just win by fighting, it won by surviving. It created the pilots who lived long enough to become legends. It embodied the nation that refused to quit. It was, quite literally, the juggernaut that changed the sky. When the thunder rolled across Europe, it carried one message: you can hit us all you want, we're still coming.